Thank you, Preben. So, it's working. Who am I? Yeah, and with Preben's introduction, you might consider whether it's me having this talk since I've been working with Agile for maybe the past 18 years. Made a living, made Agile, tried to make Agile work in various settings, classical IT, combinations of IT and hardware and lots of stuff, but all the way to microorganisms, enzymes, developing the actual wind turbines, like 700 tons of steel, 100 meters in the air, 40 kilometers from shore. How can you do that more effectively? And I think what I've come to realize is that this is much more about helping organizations innovate better, finding ways to work in a more efficient manner. And then whether we want to label it Agile or something else, that's a different question. But I really share Preben's frustration in terms of how we have managed to approach Agile, I can't say for 25 years, but at least for the past 18 years. And one of the key things that keeps on frustrating me is this notion of Agile being reduced to a set of practices. And it's not that practices are bad, and you'll see that throughout my talk. Practices all have their place and time, at least most of them. SAFe might be the exception.
That's not Agile.
But that's not Agile. But the point where we make these practices our end goal, then our solution space suddenly narrows to a very, very limited number of options. And there seems to be this notion that as soon as you start to discuss options outside this space, then you're wrong. You're not doing it right. Or you're not following the principles all the way. And had you just done that, you would have surfaced all the bottlenecks and you would have solved all your problems in the exact right way. And that's my problem. I'm just going to share with you today a number of cases in terms of where I have seen Agile gone wrong in real life. And then fortunately we'll have some time for questions at the end where you can share your perspectives. A small disclaimer, when I go through this, don't think of this applying, any of these things applying to all people, all organizations, all the time. So as I said, most of these things have their place in time where they're actually a pretty nice fit, but it's due to the context, not to them being an internal rule that you can keep following and you will make that a success in all possible scenarios. So when you ask people, what is Agile? Like you get a lot of different answers. When you go out and have interviews now, you'll get people saying, okay, it's a mindset. I can't really define it, but it's something about being free. Okay, so it's all work towards being free. What does that mean in real life? It's very, very hard to define what does freedom mean in an organizational context. But most of the time, you'll actually get people talking about something like this. So all sorts of tools, sets of practices, everything from design thinking to double diamond to Scrum, Agile, Scrum, Kanban, SAFe, Lex, Nexus, you name it. And all of these are instances of practices used in sometimes an Agile setting, sometimes not. But the problem is that when we reduce our notion of Agile, then we get these religious fights over right and wrong, where both parties most of the time are often just wrong. Because, again, they're discussing this from the notion that there's a blueprint for being right. And there's a set of practices involved when you're right. And that's the only way you can do it. And if you're not with me, then you're against me. And if you don't believe in all aspects of a product owner or Scrum Master, then by definition, you're not part of my little cult here. And I'm going to be against you because you're talking about flow and Kanban. So by definition, you will find yourselves in a different community, and that's not my community. Or with the new the evolution of SAFe, it gets even worse because now you don't have to follow a reasonable amount of practices and principles. Now you have to follow 300 elements, though you do have the ability to pick and choose. So again, my main question is, what happened to context? What happened to individuals and their interactions? What happened to actually respecting that there might be other options out there? What happened to continuous improvement, innovation, and being able to find better ways of working that we haven't found yet, but are just on our way to discover? When did that become wrong in an Agile setting? That's against the very notion of inspecting and adapting and continuous improvement. So it's become a monster, at least in some places. And it's this religious fight over right and wrong, where you will be dragged down by one of the forefathers of Scrum or SAFe or whatever if you don't do things right. And in their minds, there is only one way to approach scaling Agile in any organizational setting. So no matter if you're using it to build a fighter plane or you're using it to build IT, there's just one way to scale. And you do need Agile release trains, no matter the context. I've seen Agile release trains implemented in the context of 8 people. Yeah. So you can call that an Agile release train, but most of us would just call that a team, right? And you can do PI planning for 12 weeks ahead in a setting and try to coordinate among those 8 people 12 weeks ahead, or you could choose to do it more dynamically. But the fact that you're trying to use the same scaling framework for 8 people seems that you got something wrong at some point. So it's not, and don't get me wrong here, it's not that these things are bad. Some of them are. But most of these things are actually quite sensible if you choose to use them in the right context. But again, turning it into a blueprint, that is not where we want to go as a community. And how about being slightly open to new input from the outside? Even if that means you sometimes have to find a different way of anchoring your business context in a team besides the role of a product owner. Maybe there's another option. Maybe you can find ways of addressing the fact that you need to drive continuous improvement and the solving of bottlenecks without having a Scrum Master. If a team is successful doing it, you might actually be curious about how they're doing it, instead of trying to blame them for not following a method or framework. And this is a very important point. There is no data ever suggesting that there is one set of practices that are superior in general to another set of practices. It's just not there. They even did a study showing that SAFe, and I don't like SAFe, but I have to admit, when they measure how you're doing in terms of anchoring your business context, how fast you're iterating towards your customers, how adaptable you are in the market, SAFe doesn't do much worse or better than any other framework or method out there. So there's nothing to suggest that one set of practices are superior to other practices out there. So that religious fight, it's just based on pure I feel that this should be good. And I feel my way is better than your way. There's no data suggesting that's actually true. There are many excuses, however. And I get this one a lot. So if as a manager I want to mix teams all the time and move people around, they will be confused. So if we don't all do things in the same way across the organization, then I can't move people around anymore. And there are 2 major problems with this statement. One being, we're not optimizing to move people around all the time. That's actually part of trying to develop some continuous improvement mechanics or actually do things better for the long term, because you know you're going to be part of this context for more than just the next 2 weeks. The other part is that you've got people with master degrees, maybe even PhDs, and you think they're going to be confused because there's a second column on the board that doesn't look exactly like the other team. Or maybe the product owner is used in a slightly different way, or maybe they're using a different set of tools, but they're going to learn that within a week's time. So you're just coming up with excuses because you feel it's nice that if the whole organization is working the same way, you can look at roles the same way, you can look at the patterns in the same way, and you can feel like an old-style traditional manager controlling the whole setup of all these mechanics working nicely together. We also get this. It's a proven method. No, it's not. There's no proof out there. At least I haven't seen it. There's a lot of hearsay and a lot of people talking about, I feel this is better, but there's no proof out there. Yeah, and as I mentioned in the beginning, this notion that if you just do it by the book, you will be forced to address the real problems. You can't deviate around the real problems anymore, because if you're doing hardcore Scrum or hardcore SAFe or Lex or Nexus or Kanban, you will be dealing with the right problems. And what you just have to realize is, if you do it this way, your solution space is going to be 100 times smaller than the real solution space available to you. And I would argue that in 90% of the cases, if you've spent longer than 1 or 2 months trying to deal with things by the book, thinking that's going to solve your problems, there are probably better options available to you. I'm not saying you should give up just within the first week. But if you've spent a number of weeks trying to do something and just can't get, maybe there are simpler ways of doing it. There's something wrong with this clicker. Yeah. So finally, if we cannot share insights, we cannot share insights if we're not doing things in the same way. And it's much like the argument that people will be confused if there is a different number of columns in their specific team compared to the one where they worked before. The assumption that people cannot share knowledge, they cannot share insights, they cannot, if we're not talking about a product owner as the exact same thing in two different teams. Or we can't talk about how we do planning if we're not having the same amount of time available or doing planning in the exact same way in two different teams. Or maybe one team is not doing planning at all. I don't buy into that notion at least. And then the final one. I hear there's so much talk about mandates. It seems that every time an organization gets into trouble, they think that a new mandate is going to solve their problem. So something goes wrong, and as Dan said in a previous talk, then you hire a chief of security, because then you get some management attention, making sure that now you have some mandate to go off and do something about our security. And in 90% of the cases, you don't need a mandate. You just need the right people to talk to each other or to challenge each other. And if that conversation is not taking place, it's not a mandate problem. It's a problem of you not having people communicating. And I know that it sounds a bit laissez-faire, but it's really a key problem that you're having these long list of mandates, and they just go on. And it's the same thing in a team context. We need the product owner to have the mandate to be able to prioritize X or Y. And the problem is that product owner is not talking to the business, or he's not talking to his or her stakeholders. And you think that a mandate for them to prioritize is going to solve the problem of you not interacting with the outside world. How about focusing on having the right people sharing information? And then if at the end we need to discuss whether we should go one way or the other, we can talk about whether we can make that decision or not. But that's in 90% of the cases, that's just not our real problem. Oh. Something is... It just jumped a number of slides, sorry. There we go. I think I'm okay. Good. Yeah. So, we shouldn't be surprised. Our brains are by default lazy. So if we look at something and somebody will come across and offer a solution, a blueprint, saying if you just do it like this, then you're going to be happy. You don't have to understand anything behind it. But if you implement these roles or these structures, then you're going to be fine. Our brains are triggered to say, yes, that's a perfect solution. That's exactly how I want to do this. And I don't have to think at all. So we're programmed to avoid any kind of friction and just take the easy way ahead. The problem is that doesn't make the consequences of following that path any less severe. So we can still become a huge train wreck by following these assumptions. But our brains will just naturally try to follow the path of less resistance. The fact that the resistance is going to occur in a week's time, or in 2 months' time, or half a year's time, that's a different problem. But right now, it just feels like if you can stop me thinking, and I can just install this blueprint, I'm just going to be happy because I can just sit back. So what happens when we do this? Well, I'm pretty sure you all heard the notion of a sprint commitment, right? So that's great, right? So as an entire team now we get together, and if we can just commit to this amount of work, then we're all going to be happy, motivated, and we're going to achieve great results. And for some, it really works, and we have to admit that. But for others, it's just a terrible idea, because in that particular context, it's the notion of a commitment is basically just you have promised and you're going to do whatever it takes, no matter the overtime, no matter the quality sacrifices, no matter what, to achieve this particular result. So in some contexts, this works, and in some contexts, it's absolutely miserable, and it will continue not providing you with great results endlessly. But you can't discuss whether that's a good or bad idea if you as an organization have decided that sprint commitment is an essential part of how you want to work. We also, some of us were brought up, and it's also written in the Agile Manifesto, that working software is the primary measure of progress, right? So suddenly only working software counts. And again, in our great theoretical world, that's going to produce always great results. We're going to get fast feedback into the market. We're going to test it on real customers. But in the real world, that can be an incredibly expensive way to build things to scale from the first day. Because what if you shouldn't be building this at all? So it can be a huge waste of money where we can, with a simple prototype or a prototype or a fake door, we can produce great insights and we can buy information much, much cheaper. But if we've locked our solution space down so we can only validate and get feedback through working software, then again, a lot of money can be wasted out there. And we settle on things on a practice level rather than on trying to find out how can we buy information as cheaply as possible. And then there's the opposite. So now somebody heard about product discovery. And that's a much better way of buying information, right? So we do that on everything. Even when it's simple stuff. Even if we've been working with this domain for the past 20 years, our competitors have got this feature, we just need to implement it to stay up to par. And again, if we continue down that road of being practice-focused, we're going to do product discovery. Trying to find out, is this really the right way to go when all our competitors have just launched this feature, they're having great success, and now we want to validate whether that's a good idea. Maybe we should just go and build some working software. But again, if we've settled on things on a practice level, we can't move outside that solution space. And I kid you not, there are still organizations out there in 2023 thinking that the only possible solution is to have full-time Scrum Masters. And they're still chasing this graph over here, where they thought they have 100 teams with 100 Scrum Masters, and all of them are going to move gradually from doing team-level work towards doing more organizational cross-team improvement. Imagine 100 people, if that was even possible, imagine 100 people trying to do that at once. It would be absolute chaos. So in reality, we've sometimes got really sad people out there. And they're thinking of themselves as a failure because apparently I'm the only one here that cannot fill my entire calendar with relevant work as a full-time position. And we've made them think that they're wrong, that they're the ones not being able to fulfill this role to perfection, where in reality we've just placed them in a very, very difficult situation because they did everything right. And now their Scrum Master duties are down to maybe being realistically 20% of their time, and they have no space to fill the rest. Where instead, had we explored the solution space of being a bit more flexible, saying, so maybe you can do some work helping finish a user story, maybe you can do some business analysis, maybe you have background in development, I don't know. But if we go to the team with the purpose of, okay, saying, then maybe over time your role is going to shift. And maybe there's not going to be so much in the beginning, it might be a full-time thing, but half a year down the road, what can you then do? Then suddenly our solution space for solving this problem and avoiding people being really frustrated becomes much better. I don't know how many times I've seen this. Teams struggling and struggling and struggling to make this sprint review their perfect feedback loop. So this is where all the stakeholders, they come in, they have relevant feedback, they celebrate, they're happy, the team takes this feedback back into their backlog, they reevaluate their next sprint, and then they go and offer an even better version of their sprint backlog because now they got all this great feedback. And the real world is just not always like that. Because sometimes you have work with a broad set of stakeholders, and if you invite them in, all of them, all the time, it's just going to be very difficult for them to stay engaged because sometimes they shouldn't be there. And sometimes you need to go much, much deeper. Sometimes you need to have literally one-on-one conversations where you sit down and you try this out together with them and you get much deeper feedback. And you can only do that in a kind of a one-on-one setting. But if we narrow our solution space of feedback down to a review session, again, we're talking about 1% of our entire solution space of how we can get relevant feedback, both qualitatively and quantitatively from the world around us. So again, it's not that the sprint review is a bad thing. It's just if we use that as our only way of trying to be agile, our solution space just becomes so small. And I've heard this many times from agile coaches. I even heard one agile coach saying, if you have deadlines, you're not agile. Okay, that's an interesting perspective. So what if you find yourself theoretically in a project where there's a 1 week window, 1 time a year, where you can go ahead and install some physical artifacts because you actually need to change the very room. You don't consider that agile if it seems to have a deadline that's pretty relevant and nope, you're not agile. Okay. But what if the real world is different? And what if we have some flexibility in terms of scope? What if we can go live and then we can, much like a Tesla, so you can buy, a friend of mine bought a Tesla X some years ago, and the rain sensor was not working. And he could only go 80 kilometers with the self-steering thing. And then on our way to the ski resort, we popped in and it did an update, and suddenly the rain sensor was working and we could go 90 with the self-steering. So the hardware, that was the deadline. They needed the hardware on the road, and you couldn't change the hardware afterwards. At least it was very, very difficult. But you could definitely evolve the software. And you find yourselves in a situation like this where it's much more about discussing what is our option space and how can we be more flexible if we can't achieve all. But stating that you can't be agile if you have a deadline, I don't know where you got that from. At least I can't read it anywhere in the literature or... Come on. So another way where I see Agile sometimes turning into more of this religious discussion is when organizations start to look at this aspect of a cross-functional team from a very, very narrow space, where you have to have all the skills available to you. So you will actually, and sometimes they'll build teams of 12 and 15 people to make sure that every single specialist in there, so you have covered the entire value chain. And I get it. I get the thought process behind it, that you want decoupled organizations. You want people to chase it and own their own results and not be dependent. But if you're in need of a specialist once a month, it's not the best idea to take that very world-class specialist, put them in a team where 95% of the time they're going to have to do some work that is not very relevant in terms of this. You might actually there consider that there might be a slight thing here where you're not fully cross-functional, but where you can share some resources once in a while across the organization. That's not going to ruin your entire setup, I promise. I've seen it work quite brilliantly many times. And again, I think a very common scenario is that people will keep hammering and hammering and hammering on this product owner role, right? They read it in the Scrum Guide. It's perfect, right? If you can do all this stuff without getting stressed out and going on sick leave for several months, you're just going to be amazing. And then we look at real organizations out there, and they're really, really struggling. Because sometimes you don't get all those things in one person. But that doesn't, as Dan said in the previous talk, that doesn't make them a bad person. That just means they're really, really good at the aspect of going out to customers, talking to them, but they're quite horrible at making sure that you've got the things in place for the next sprint. But maybe if we were a true cross-functional team and we actually worked a bit with our T-Pride, maybe we could compensate. But if we keep chasing and just blaming that one person for not being the perfect product owner, I've seen people doing that for several years. Several years into the Agile initiative, they're still complaining about that same person. How do you think it feels going to work and being blamed for not being the person you're not every single day? And again, I'm not saying that the perfect product owner is a bad solution. I'm just saying sometimes there are other options available to us and we need to explore those. And it's not written anywhere, neither in the Agile Manifesto or anywhere else, that you cannot share some parts of that role. Does it come with a compromise and a trade-off? Sure it does. But so does the one single ringable neck. Oh, this one is one of my favorites. So, now we're going Agile. Project managers are no longer needed. A whole set of skills out the door. That was from the old world where you're doing the micromanagement, thinking about how should you do that today, and then giving people the daily task list. Project management is no longer something we need in an Agile setting. The problem again is then the real world hits us. And those organizations that threw all these people out, they suddenly find themselves in a quite complex environment. So it might be regulatory requirements. If you're working with microorganisms, you need to go through a set of very, very strict gates. Not something you decide as an organization, but simply to be able to put your products legally into the market. That requires a lot of pre-planning and making sure that you send the right form to the right people at the right time, that you follow up, that you do the things right. And to be honest, I'm not seeing the chemist, the average chemist, being really interested in doing all that stuff. While they're pretty happy if somebody that really likes that stuff is brought into the team and can do the project management responsibilities. So talking about project management not being needed is a bit far-stretched, right? We might talk about whether project management as a role is something we could discuss. But the capability of doing project management, you will find yourself sometimes in a setting where that's quite relevant. And again, if we just go to this from a religious perspective, it's going to be a very narrow solution space. And you suddenly have to have engineers or chemists or whatever sitting there doing things they hate because you refuse to bring in the capabilities needed to succeed. How many of you have been part of sprint planning sessions lasting more than, let's say, 2 hours? So at least half, maybe more. How many of you have been part of sprint planning meetings lasting more than 4 hours? Good. We're trending the right way. It's not so long ago that it was not at all unusual to walk into an organization and you would see teams sitting there for full days, like literally from 8 to 4 doing sprint planning. And the funny thing is they were not so much considering what is the value of the exercise we're now participating in. They were doing it because they thought that the idea of Scrum was to now sit down, break things down into almost hourly tasks, put them all together in a sprint backlog so that they were ready and didn't have to communicate with the outside world for the coming 2 weeks. And again, now we can talk about forgetting first principles, right? So the whole notion of Agile was to be able to grab something, deal with uncertainty, talk to the outside world, be more clever, get it into the market, get even more feedback. And suddenly you find these teams closing themselves around themselves, trying to pre-plan everything as if they were trying to do perfect waterfall in a 2-week cycle. And again, sprint planning in general is not bad. We find several teams out there succeeding and doing it for years and years and years. But again, if we're not opening up to the fact that there might be different versions of doing that planning session, or we might be able to target reducing it to an hour, or we might just talk about maybe it's not a fixed time box. Maybe we're talking about the focus of the next 2 weeks. And maybe we don't have to start and end all tasks in the same time box. Maybe we can allow people to say, okay, so there's a day left of our sprint here. I would really like it. It's meaningful to me and the customer to start this next one, but I can't because I'm not allowed to because it will continue 2 days into the coming iteration. Again, this notion of flexibility, it's just important, and we just see it sacrificed, unfortunately, quite often. Also one of my favorites. So, and I know, if you go, and to be honest, when I saw that burn down charts are no longer part of the Scrum Guide, it was I almost cried a bit. It seemed that suddenly they were starting to open up for the fact that there's not one practice to rule them all in terms of trying to achieve some level of predictability and proactivity in terms of whether we're going to finish stuff or not. So that was quite a moment for me personally. But that doesn't keep organizations from still chasing this as like the picture of effectiveness. And it seems that in general people are confusing effectiveness with predictability. So there's this notion that if you complete your sprints every time, then you're effective. No, that's just, you're predictable. And you might be doing the wrong stuff for the wrong people. You might have a huge amount of buffer, or you might be working incredibly ineffectively, but you're just predictable. That's not the same as effectiveness. There might be a link between the two. So if everything is chaos, you might have no predictability whatsoever. But saying that one equals the other, again, that's stretching it quite a bit. The worst case I've seen was one organization where a big consultant company, they had grown the notion that burn down charts was like the way to cascade Agile. So you would see from 60 teams burn down charts being communicated all the way to the CEO, who would sit there, evaluate the burn down charts, look at them and say, you're brilliant. Great. And the one team that consistently won that competition, you know what they did? They coded a little bit of random functions in Excel, so it would create not exactly the same burn down every single time, but all the time it would always end on 0. There was no coupling to reality and the work they were doing, but that burn down chart just looked perfect every single time. So they were highlighted again and again as the team to follow. Right? So it's healthy that they acknowledge that this is not meaningful to our customers, to us, to our ways of working, so we're just going to game it, and then we can go back and do our real work. And again, I know I've been talking about the product owner a few times already, But there seems to be this notion that we have this end goal of getting a product owner from the business side and bringing it into a team, and that's going to solve all our problems. So it's like you have won when you've managed to kidnap that person from the business and bring them into the team. It matters little whether they want to be there, whether they have the skills available to be there. What matters is that you now managed to bring that person in. I've even seen organizations when they scaled Agile initially, and they had about 100 teams, because the business, they were quite busy. But they had to fulfill this check mark of sending a product owner. So they would hire people with no network in the organization, no knowledge about their products, no business capabilities, but now they came from the business side. So they would be straight out of university, sitting there in a team, having absolutely no clue whatsoever. But wow, were they happy, because they all had a product owner from the business, right? And it seems that the inspired book, Pragmatic, is becoming a big thing these days. So I see a lot of organizations adopting these principles. I think many of them are really, really healthy. I think the notion of bringing discovery work into a more formalized way of working in teams, I think that's great. But again, it seems that we're now falling into the same trap again. So now we see organizations narrowing their solution space in a different solution space. So suddenly it becomes a matter of finding this trio of a product manager, a product designer, and an engineering lead. And that is now the goal. So no longer are they considering whether that is totally decoupling the rest of the team from the customer side of the equation, or whether they can't have dialogues with stakeholders because it's all going on in this trio. Because the trio now suddenly became the new goal to follow. And I also have to say, though there are so many great things in the inspired book, it is also very American, and with that follows quite an extensive hierarchy of information being brought both up and down in the organization. So if you read it narrowly, you'll see that the VP of product will go in and evaluate every single feature or user story being developed in every single team to give them feedback on whether that's the right way to go. I'm not sure that scales very well, and I'm not sure it's the right approach if you truly want to have them own their own products and market. I also had one colleague once tell me that Agile, that's just about letting go. So you should just, all kinds of constraints, that's just disempowering people, and that's just making it impossible for them to deliver the right product to the right customer. And actually, some of these people have been quite successful communicating this message to organizations. And we found some quite horrible stuff happening. Because suddenly, if your very reason to exist is up to you to define, that means that in Novozymes, in context, they were not the ones doing this. You would have to consider, are we going to develop toothpaste for dogs or biodiesel? Wow, that's a big question, right? Or we could also go in a totally different direction and go into the rainforest and see whether this particular bacteria can produce an enzyme nobody has seen before. What can we use that for? And suddenly you just saw decision paralysis. You would just see decision paralysis all over the place, because giving people total freedom where they need to define themselves, their very reasons for this team to exist, that's not necessarily producing great results and happy employees. So it's not that you need a huge amount of constraints, but if you can talk about why is this team in this organization, and what are they supposed, what type of value outcome are they should they be trying to deliver? That's actually a constraint that's typically quite positive. It's actually also quite positive of saying you don't have endless budgets. You have this amount of money or this amount of people to create this result, and you have to do it within that. Because we've seen organizations with endless budgets where teams will just start to hire themselves out of problems. And suddenly you'll see teams growing to 19 people thinking that now suddenly something is going to happen, and still no software or no products seem to be evolving. So there are positive constraints, and no constraints. I would never recommend that to any company. You've probably seen this a few times. So this notion that you start as a beginner, right? And then you evolve up, and suddenly you end up as an expert where you almost don't know what you're doing, because it's just intuition. And that's just not reality, right? Not if you're working with people that spent 5 years at university. You can't tell them, just go ahead and do stuff, and then you will learn to love it. You'll have to talk about why is this a real thing and why is this important to us and why do we do this? And this notion that if you don't start by just telling people do this and you don't have to understand it, you just have to do it, I think that's disrespecting people sometimes with 15 years of experience in the field. You know nothing. I'm now introducing you to something that's so new and brilliant that I almost don't understand it, but it's just brilliant, trust me. I don't know how many, do we have any leaders who would consider themselves leaders, part of leadership in an organization? Any of you been to leadership training? Anybody that found that leadership training had a huge impact on your day-to-day behavior? A single one. I must take note of how they did that. No, so there's this notion that teams, they get training, and we know it's not going to do much, but then we use that training when we often do the actual stuff to point, oh, do you remember that part of the training? That's why we're doing this right now. But leaders, you can send them just on a half-day training course, and then they're going to go out and be completely different people afterwards. Right? So there's this bridge missing between training and actual application. And to be honest, especially on the leadership level, I have rarely seen such of a decouple between training and ability to actually use that in a practical context. So for leadership especially, it's really, really important that you go hands-on. And you need hands-on. They need to have feedback on their actual leadership behavior and actual situations. And I think Carl mentioned that they have been doing book clubs. And I think that's much better than just the training because you do get to use your brain and evaluate it from your own context. But it's not enough. You need to take it a step further. Yeah. Also see this one, right? So close. And that's the good thing about being a framework consultant, because you can always point to something that's missing, right? And if you had just done that very last thing, everything would be perfect and things would just be working beautifully. And the problem is not that the framework is wrong, it's that you're missing this part. And then when it turned out that you got that part right, then unfortunately you hadn't implemented another part to the full extent of the prescription. So there's still a slight thing here I need to help you with. And you can go on like that forever, because when you then start in one end of the organization, something will have sometimes evolved in a different direction and you can start all over again. Anybody saw the Save 6.0 new version? Finally, you get to use AI, right? So the rest of the world is a couple of months ahead of you, but fortunately now you also get to stay buzzword compliant. I hope none of you had the nerve to implement AI in your setting before they put it on that map. Same with OKRs, right? Oh my God, you were almost 2 years behind. It was a catastrophic event. So finally, a bit of advice. The world is not context-free, and neither are your practices. And I think that's a very, very important thing to remember. You have very different customers, very different products, very different markets you're trying to implement those products in. You have different individuals. And I can promise you that is your ability to succeed with any framework has actually less to do with your context and more to do with your individuals. If you have people that have had a bad experience with Scrum, you can teach them all you want about Scrum, but for the very problem of them having a bad experience, they're going to not make it work. While sometimes you get Scrum where it's a horrible fit to the actual organization and the context they find, but because they're so passionate about making it work, they're going to make it work. And you can point to a lot of stuff that they could do better, but they're so passionate about wanting this tool to work that they will make it work. So those individuals, you can't disregard them. And I think that's why they mentioned it somewhere in the Agile Manifesto once upon a time. The bad news is that once the world is no longer a practice, say a blueprint of practices, you will need to start to actually use your brain. And as I mentioned at the beginning, your brain doesn't really like that. It would like just a path of no resistance, so there's not going to be any things where I need to expend more energy than I need. But if you want to do things so they actually matter, then you need to bring in that why, and which turns me to my next slide here. I get it. It's really difficult to run a change management exercise if all you've got is like a mindset. And as I also hoped I convinced you today, neither is it very good to use a set of practices as a blueprint. But there's something in between. There are actually principles behind those things that are worth fighting for. So the notion that you should have a purpose as a team, there should be a reason for you to exist, I think that's almost like globally applicable. That if you design your structure outside in, facing your markets and your customers, you're probably going to do better than if you organize around technical stacks or functional capabilities. That if you can bring your decision power closer to the information, then you can iterate faster. And if you can do smaller batches, then you can get things early out there, and you can buy information cheaper. And it's not going to be so much wasted work when you've been sitting there for 6 months doing something that nobody would really like to use. And if you invest in feedback loops, then you're probably going to do better. Because if you invest time in closing that feedback loop, you're going to know more about what's right or wrong for the next things you're going to prioritize. And if you avoid, as with Henrik Niebeck's work, trying to push more paper into the printer to make it print faster, you're probably also going to have better flow. So having this system that can somehow balance demand and capacity is probably also a sensible principle to work from. But if you disregard your whole technical stack and the maturity of how you work and how you use your technical practice, it's going to be really difficult because it's going to be a superficial process exercise. But you cannot really build on that platform because it will require you 6 months of manual regression tests to get things out there. So you need to work and focus on that as well, at least if you're digital. And if you lead in a very traditional manner, top down, and you micromanage and you control, or if leadership is totally absent and nobody is providing any challenges or insights from the out to the team, then you're probably also going to be worse off. And I'm not saying this is something you can just take a picture of, but I think there are first principles behind what we do in Agile that are truly worth fighting for, but where we're not down to individual practices, and we need to discuss whether daily stand-ups at 9 or 10 are better than those from 11 or 12, or whether we can do something where we don't need to have daily stand-ups at all. And I do think that this notion of structure deserves a small extra comment. And the reason why is that I have visited a lot of companies in 18 years, like a lot. And I still can't think of a really effective organization that had an inside-out structure. So I would say that all of them had built their structure around their markets, their customers, their services, what they wanted to expose and gain value from to the outside world. While I've seen some being successful, but not really effective if they're built inside out, because you're just going to have so many dependencies. It's going to be so difficult for me as an engineer to tie my work to the end result. I am going to be demotivated at being 6 steps away from the actual result. I don't want to spend my time coordinating with these 7 other teams or specialists because I want to just produce value. So I think structure does deserve an extra notion. I've even seen an organization where they had decoupled the organizational structure and were so autonomous in their business units that SAFe didn't hurt them a lot. So they actually had quite great business agility using SAFe, because whatever the business unit they had, like the board of directors, could give them advice, and they could choose to ignore that advice because they could just chase value within their separate business units. And I think that's a lot. So when you come to where if SAFe is no longer a problem in terms of business agility, then there is something about this structural element. And I get it. You can't just throw people into the deep water and saying, okay, just use these first principles and go do whatever. Starter kits are great. And sometimes even Scrum is a really good way to get started. But you need to communicate it as a starter kit. And if you can even, from the day one, talk about the why behind these elements in the starter kit. So the very first time a team has a daily stand-up, just use 2 minutes saying, okay, so what did we do in this meeting that made us able to proceed with today's or tomorrow's work in a way we couldn't have done had we not had this meeting? That will make people's brains start to work, and they'll start to say, okay, we didn't just do this to share our status with the Scrum Master. It was actually to be able to coordinate work in a way that we couldn't do if we had not been standing here for the last 15 minutes. And the same with the other events, roles, practices. Ask yourselves those first principle questions. Constantly challenge, even from day one, even when people have got no experience. And I know this is not a change management talk, so I'm not going to go too much into that. But just change management-wise, what we see again and again is people that are trying to do it all at the same time. Like for all parts of the business, with all the first principles or practices involved, and they're just drowning in noise. So please, if you're doing a change initiative, use some of the principles behind in terms of vertical slices, testing in one business unit. I think Dan also mentioned that same thing I work from. Somewhere between, I think he said 50 to 100. In my mind, it's more 50 to 150. That is the type of size that is manageable, where you can also validate real stuff, because one pilot team that will always succeed. They're gonna succeed, you're gonna be happy, use that story, but there is no validation going on in terms of the organizational context. And finally, don't get me wrong, interfaces are important, but remember, they're called interfaces for a reason. And that's both if it's a technical interface, it's because you actually have some freedom to implement things in the way you want behind that interface. And maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's great if we send a few people to a meeting where they coordinate, but how they do stuff behind the scenes and how they came up with the input for that meeting where you coordinate, maybe it's okay if they do that slightly different. Yes, so make sure you discuss the same thing. Are you discussing the tools to the left here? Are you discussing your first principles or core capabilities in the middle? Are you discussing how you improve as an organization to the left here? And just remember, we would all like to tie that to our end business results and our culture. But that's not how the real world works, because these are lagging indicators. And the culture changes from the way you do things at the top here. It doesn't change by a cultural workshop that you try to do bottom up. It's much easier to act yourself into a new way of thinking than think yourself into a new way of acting. I think this quote is. So, take back your freedom. Don't let practices enslave you. And dare to help create the patterns of tomorrow, not just the ones we've already learned.